A couple points. I see Jeff Kaufman up there. I haven't met him, but I've received some emails, so thanks for sending me pictures, and I'll get back to you soon. Vladimir Levin is on. He gave a great lecture about the history of the Schulhof in Eastern Europe, the square where the synagogue and all ancillary buildings were. And I believe that's probably online now somewhere. And he's giving 2 more lectures on synagogues in Eastern Europe coming up. And I want to give a shout out to the Center for Jewish Art, since we were talking about the decoration of synagogues, because they have put together a great index of synagogue wall painting curated by Boris Haimovich, but only for European paintings. But it's the place to start all research. And we're trying, and I'm trying to work with the CJA and to create an American component of that. And since the Burlington project, which you referenced, which began about 2014, we have now identified about a dozen extant examples of immigrant synagogue wall painting in the United States, and many more examples that we have fragmentary evidence through occasional photographs. But I guess there were probably scores and maybe hundreds of these small synagogues that were painted, but they've all been either torn down, or they've been abandoned or turned into churches. And we need to step up the research on that. And that's an area that I'm working just these days. And there was a conference at the Center for Jewish Art on that topic, on synagogue wall painting, a few years ago. And I did give a presentation primarily about the Burlington mural. And I think that is online via the Center for Jewish Art site. But sometime I'd be happy to give a talk just on synagogue wall painting. And I love talking about it. So we'll get to that sometime soon. Okay, I've just put my timer on. 50 minutes, and if there's more material, you get another bonus episode. But let's get started. You're going to have a virtual trip to Israel. I do have a few Israeli images of synagogues, but I confess it's not my area of expertise, and I'll probably breeze over them. But it's important to know that in the post-war period, Israel was obviously, well, actually in the period of the mandate as well, in the interwar years, Palestine and then Israel obviously have been centers of 20th century synagogue design and building, and that includes innovative modern buildings too. Okay, let me try to get to. All right, what is modern about this? We're looking on the right at the 1896, 1897 fifth building of Congregation Shereth Israel on the Upper West Side in New York. This is the current building of the oldest congregation in the United States. They kept moving uptown and building new buildings, and we mentioned some of their earlier buildings in previous talks. The thing about modern is it's a relative term. Every age has its modernism, and what is current at the time, what people are saying is up to date, is what is being promoted as modern. Today we have an idea of modern as a style that got codified in the 1930s, and particularly codified through a series of art exhibitions, including the one on the international style at the Museum of Modern Art. But modernity is something that is very elusive, and each generation has its own sense of it. It's like the way we change clothes or hairstyles, or even the music in religious liturgy. We sometimes take popular music and then transform that into something appropriate for religious use, but it is now modern. It's a modern liturgy as opposed to an older traditional one. Yesterday's modernism is today's tradition. There was a time, of course, when Hasidism was the modern, radical, almost heretical branch of Judaism. Today, people see Hasids in their black dress and their strimmels, and they think that that is traditional Judaism. But it's not. It's a Judaism of a particular time that was modern and now has become, traditional or even ossified. They haven't moved on. They chose that style and decided to stick with it. In synagogue design, we have rapid fire development of the skins of buildings, the look, like the fashion, and we call these the styles. And we looked at the Romanesque and the Gothic and the Moorish, and now we have the classical. And each one sort of becomes popular for a time, and people think of it as modern. But essentially, the buildings are similar, and what goes on in the building is similar, except we do know that in the 19th century, there were radical changes in Judaism, both as an institution, as a practiced religion, as a communal organization. So there was modernity that got coupled to certain architectural changes. Classicism in the 1890s was the modern style, and it was a style that was rapidly embraced by the new reform movement because it was so American, and it identified the reform movement, which primarily drew from an German and Central European population, already second, third generation Jews who'd arrived in the 1820s and 1840s and 1860s. And they wanted to emphasize not only their religious difference from the newly arrived Eastern European, Yiddish-speaking, Orthodox, poorer immigrants. They want to differentiate from them their religious practice, but they also wanted to differentiate that they were more American. And so if there was going to be discrimination or anti-Semitism against Jews, it shouldn't be against these German or the Central European Reform Jews who'd been American for several generations. There had to be a way to show that there was a distinction. So the classic style became, for the Reform movement, actually a branding, and it was a modern look. Now, this fit in with trends in American architecture because American architecture was very eclectic, as we saw. And then in 1893, there was the big Columbian Exposition in Chicago when the so-called White City was built. And the White City was all classical, Roman classical buildings, lots of big columns and Corinthian capitals and big pediments and domes. And this suddenly became the rage and the popular and the modern style in America, picked up by the City Beautiful movement. It was used for banks and courthouses and university buildings, and Jews, particularly in the Reform movement, adopted it too. Now, Shereth Israel is not a Reform congregation. It is a Sephardi Orthodox congregation. They had never abandoned classicism, and we've seen that it was used in their building going back to Crosby Street and then to 19th Street. So they were ready to embrace it just immediately after 1893, as soon as a little economic depression ended. But very quickly, the style became popular across the country with the wealthier Jewish communities, who were mostly Reform, who were able to build new buildings. And Arnold Brunner, who is the architect of Shereth Israel, and he was born in 1857, so he's really the first American-born Jewish successful architect. He switched styles. He had built this building we saw in the last talk in 1891, which is located just across, or was located just across Central Park. But then after 1893, he switched to the classical style, and then he never left the classical style again. He went on to write all the articles about architecture for the Jewish Encyclopedia. He wrote in contemporary architecture magazines. He was the president of the American Institute of Architects, New York chapter. He was one of the most public and most famous architects in America by about 1910, when he built the new federal building in Cleveland. And he continued to build synagogues through much of his career. He had started sort of as the favorite architect of the New York Jewish community, and he was of that class. He was born into the Jewish aristocracy, on both sides of his family. And he trained at MIT, he worked with prominent architects, and he took a leading position. And he championed classicism not only as the modern and American style, but as the style most appropriate for synagogues, because he was reading the German publications, he was fluent in German, coming out of the excavations in Palestine where ancient synagogues were being revealed. And he said, listen, the oldest synagogues were classical buildings, so what more appropriate style for a synagogue is there than classicism? Of course, no ancient synagogues look like what we're seeing here. They were smaller and more solid buildings. These look more like Roman temples, pagan temples. But, you know, that's getting into the weeds, and they didn't want to discuss those distinctions. It was clear, though, that this was distinctly different from that exotic Moorish style, and this is something that that Americans could buy into across the board. So Jews liked it and non-Jews liked it, and for a long time this became the preferred style. It soon became not so modern. By the 1920s, it was the standard style, and it was adopted not only by the Reform, but by the Orthodox and the newly ascendant conservative movement. And this is just an example from Cleveland, a building that still survives. It's now a church. And every city across America had their classical buildings like this by 1929. This is also an interesting building for another social reason, and we won't go into that now. This is representative of what's called the Jewish Center movement, and there was a swimming pool in this building, there was a gymnasia, and these were efforts in the interwar years to create a whole Jewish community within the walls of a single building. This was a modern concept, and it was a way to try to entice young people into the building to play basketball, even if they weren't going to go to synagogue, to have a Jewish education, to buy bar mitzvah presents. It's the origins of our modern synagogue center, which are mostly suburban today, but we find them in the cities themselves in the interwar years. The problem is when the Depression hit, these buildings were so expensive to maintain, and many of them were carrying big mortgages, and dues paying members fell off by the hundreds at congregations because they lost their jobs and their means of paying, that many of these buildings did not survive the Depression. And when Jews kind of got their head up again above water in the post-World War II era, they moved on to different neighborhoods and left these buildings behind. Now, another form of modernism is a formal one, and what we see very popular in the 20th century, and it continues through the entire century with all different styles, it's the popularity of the dome. And we didn't see many domes before the 1890s. We saw a shallow dome in KK Beth Elohim in Charleston from the 1830s. We saw a dome in the earlier Shereth Israel in New York from the 1860s. But besides those buildings, domes really were for churches and other types of buildings. Synagogues did not include them. There are a few examples in Europe, and there are internal domes, as Vladimir Levin showed in his lecture the other day, in the wooden synagogues. But the prominent dome that we associate with sort of St. Peter's in Rome or St. Paul's in London, this was not a Jewish thing. But in the 1890s, we begin seeing domes applied to synagogues of every different style: Romanesque, Moorish, and the new, very popular classical style. And on the right is the Temple Beth El by the Jewish architect Albert Kahn, who's also the country's leading industrial architect. He designed all the car factories for Ford and Packard and many other, Franklin, many other car manufacturers. But when he built Jewish buildings, he built classically, and he built 2 synagogues for Beth El, his own congregation, and they were extremely influential. Today, they are as old-fashioned as can be, but at the time, they were very modern. But we also see almost at the same time, beginning in 1907 in Pittsburgh with the wonderful Rodef Shalom by the non-Jewish architect, very talented architect Henry Hornbostel, who designed Carnegie Mellon University. in Pittsburgh. And while he was there doing that, the congregation grabbed him to build their new synagogue too. And he had worked on some of the World's Fairs in Paris, and he brought back that kind of festive architecture of the exposition. And it has a sort of a square dome and a big skylight. It's a big airy space that brings everyone together under a big cupola. And this sort of sets a new standard as well for many types of synagogue design. The decoration is very fanciful. It's tied in with the arts and crafts movement, but it is also very highly original. The glazed tiles, the metalwork, nothing refers back to any historical precedent. Every bit of decoration here is entirely new and original. Jewish architects were very quick to pick up on this, and M.Phil in New Orleans builds the Toro Synagogue in 1909, and then Marcus Pritica in Seattle. Both of these are Jewish architects. In the early 20th century, builds a similar building, Bikor Cholim in Seattle. Toro is still in use today. It's a beautiful, beautiful building. And Bikor Cholim is now the Langston Hughes Performing Arts Center in Seattle, and you can visit it. And you can see they have low domes. They are very muscular and massive in their forms, and you know exactly what you're going to get inside this building. The outside is expressing its interior, and this is one of the standard clarion calls for modernism. We all have heard form follows function. Well, it doesn't always work that way, but here we actually can see the sanctuary is defined by these large thermal windows, what we call from Roman baths, and the low domes. We can see the entrances here. There's going to be a vestibule here, annex rooms in the back. Everything inside is understandable from the outside. Now, the dome was also very popular in Europe at the time, and certainly these American architects were aware of these things. Architectural publications were circulating worldwide, and everyone knew what was going on in other countries. Most American architects at this time were well-trained. Many had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris or at different technical universities in Germany. Many of them spoke foreign languages, usually French and German, and they could read the architectural journals, and they knew what their colleagues were doing in other countries. And the dome was widely used in Eastern and Central Europe, but different types of domes. And we can see a good example of the variety of them in the submissions for the big synagogue in Szeged in southern Hungary. The competition was won by Lipot Baumhorn, who went on to become one of the most prolific synagogue architects in the world, with many large dome structures, many fine buildings, several of which survive. And he uses a kind of Gothic, but it's a very theatrical Gothic, ascending up to a dome that has windows and is beautifully lit. His competitors, two Jewish architects, all these architects, by the way, are Jewish, Komar and Jakob, create something along this almost same plan, but they're using a different decorative style. They eschew the Gothic. There's nothing historicist here. They're using new sort of Art Nouveau forms and motifs, flowers and ferns, and it's a more playful, lighter touch. Most of it's all in the decoration, not in the architecture, but it changes the feel of the place. And we will find several architects who incorporate these newer Art Nouveau, or what's called Jugendstil, coming out of Vienna, decorative schemes, but essentially overlaying them on much of the older architectural forms. A good example is the Jubilee Synagogue in Prague, which I showed very briefly in the first lecture. This is from 1906, designed by the famous Jewish Viennese architect William Stiassny. Now, Stiassny did many Moorish-style buildings, but here in 1906, he is using not Moorish-style decorative motifs coming out of the Grammar of Ornament and other books that we'd mentioned before, but his decoration looks like it could have come out of a Parisian salon or a Parisian fashion hall or something like that. Very beautifully, delicately painted vine tendrils and leaves, and the whole thing is covered with all sorts of botanical details. The dome is best expressed, though, in Europe through the popularity of the Byzantine form coming out of Turkey with Hagia Sophia and the Balkans. And it's appropriate in Sofia, which once had been part of the Ottoman Empire, that their synagogue should be a kind of Byzantine Moorish mix. This is in 1905. But very quickly, many of this other synagogues that are built in the region keep much of the same form, but they strip away most of the decoration, and they become much more readable. And just like those American examples that I cited, you can see really from the outside what you're going to get on the inside. And they're following these Byzantine forms: a central plan, a square or circular prayer hall, and then sort of added on these big apses to extend the space, a central dome. Both the geometry and the decoration is getting simpler and simpler. And you can contrast this trend. See, the domes are all over. In Germany, in 1907, two examples, these tall domes on large drums in Detmold and Posen, now Poznan in Poland, compared to these more sedate and serene and simple domes from Mainz and Offenbach from just a few years later. This is 1912, 1916. And as we cross the threshold of World War I, things will get really simpler, both because of style and people's exhaustion after the war with the weight of history, but also because of the economic crisis of the post-World War I years. Rebuilding requires simpler materials, new materials, lower budgets, and the like. And Jewish communities, especially after World War I in Europe, are pinched financially, and they're going to have to turn to simpler means of design and construction. So the Byzantine style, which we saw intimated already in New Orleans and Seattle, really picks up steam in the 1920s in America. One of the finest examples is Temple Isaiah by the Jewish architect Alfred Altschuler in Chicago. This is the synagogue that the Obamas used to go to. They lived right across the street, and their kids went to daycare here. And it is a Byzantine style, not based on any synagogue design, but really on the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna. It originally was going to be even more lavish. This is an early design, and then it was stripped down. And most of the decoration is only in the brickwork. And otherwise, the walls are left flat and unadorned and not plastered. So the decoration is in the variety of the brick and in the clarity of the geometry and this low dome that comes through the front. Another aspect, and this is quite modern too, Altschuler devises a plan, and he'll use this again and again, where he tightens up the sanctuary to bring people as close as he can to the Ark and Bema. We're still in this theatrical setting that goes back to the mid-19th century with a performance up on a stage, essentially, and an audience watching. But instead of having a long, long box like many of the synagogues in the 19th century had, we now have something that's a bit of a horseshoe or almost a circle, where there's no seat in the sanctuary that's more than about 100 feet from the Ark. And this is a Reform synagogue, so the balcony seating is not for women, but it's only for the congregation to bring them closer in. And I'm not going to show it in this talk, but a fairly new example of a conservative synagogue, the synagogue on the Dell campus in Austin, Texas, Agudath Achim, does the same thing. It has a balcony area, not for women, but just to bring the congregation close into the action. So the balcony seats almost come right over the bema, which is more centrally placed than is the norm in most modern construction. So we do still have these big rectangular buildings, and this is the sort of the Queen Mary, the ocean liner, if you will, of all synagogues, the large beautiful Temple Emmanuel in New York, and it's done in a Byzantine medieval style. It's simply decorated. It has Guastavino encaustic tiles on the inside and beautifully painted, and it just was experienced a spectacular restoration about 10 years ago. So the synagogue just glows and sparkles, but it's a vast, vast space, and it doesn't have any of the intimacy that Temple Isaiah in Chicago has. This might have set a norm if the Depression hadn't hit. This was being built in 1929, and it wasn't actually dedicated until the spring, late winter, spring of 1930. And by that time, even though there was a whole issue of Architectural Record, the major architectural magazine in the country, dedicated to this building, it had very little influence on subsequent architecture, because during the Depression, almost all building and all synagogue building stopped, except for a few examples, one of which we'll see in a minute. And there was virtually no building between 1930 and 1945, even 1948, because there was a shortage of materials after the war. So when we get to the post-war period, the pent-up demand will create a new building boom. So this Byzantine stripped-down style transitions very easily into what we come to call Art Deco and Art Moderne, which is a style with very clear geometry, where the geometry is expressed, fully expressed, and not hidden, and decoration is stripped off, and it's mostly just architectural. There's no incrustation of decoration over the walls, and sometimes when it's very, very sleek, like an ocean liner, we call it Art Moderne, like the kinds of sets in the Ginger Rogers, Fred Astaire movie. But all of these, Byzantine, Deco, Moderne, are all really just different expressions of the same impulse to simplify and to clarify in the design. And the domes, which inherited from this church tradition, are seen as this dome of heaven, are meant to embrace the entire congregation. There are no aisles, there are no dividers, there are nothing interrupts the view of the worshiper or spectator, depends on how you want to view it, looking towards the bema and the ark. This is a beautiful Art Deco, very expensive Art Deco synagogue that was built in Paterson, New Jersey, by Frederick Wentworth was the architect. This was a very wealthy community, and this was money actually from the film industry that built this synagogue. It's a perfect, complete work of art, but unfortunately it was closed and somewhat stripped of its decoration about 15 years ago. We were able to get in and do photography of it while everything was intact, but now all of these pieces have been dispersed. It's the fullest expression of an Art Deco synagogue that we have, and like Temple Emmanuel in New York City across the river, this also was finished just on the eve of the Depression. Now, those of you in Southern California will know the Synagogue of the Stars, Rabbi Magnum's great Wilshire Boulevard temple, also finished in 1929. And this has an interesting pedigree because Abram Edelman, one of the architects, was the son of the previous rabbi. He also designed other synagogues. He was the architect of the Breed Street Synagogue that you saw on my bonus material. Interesting, he's also the great uncle, I believe, of the conservator, the painting conservator, Connie Silver, who was doing the work on the Burlington mural. So there's that. She has yichus. She actually has those credentials going back. This great building, it's not really Deco. It's not really Byzantine. It's an eclectic building with some Romanesque features, but very simply applied. And then inside this enormously dramatic dome. You have the wall paintings by the Jewish painter Hugo Balin. And Hugo Balin is someone I've been working on for years, and he deserves a a lecture all of his own. His murals here have been beautifully restored recently, and also his murals in the Griffin Observatory were recently restored, and at the Burbank City Hall. So they're all worth seeing. He was a film director and art director, and he was tapped by the Warner Brothers, who paid for those murals to do the decoration. I'm sorry if you're hearing my dog barking in the background. She's quite excited about something. The architect of the Cleveland Synagogue I just showed you, Charles Greco, did several of these buildings. He was not a Jewish architect. In fact, he designed many churches, Catholic churches, but he really had a knack for this type of building. He did the one in the Temple in Cleveland, and then he did this beautiful building in Hartford, Connecticut, one of the few buildings, synagogue buildings built during the Depression, because Hartford, the insurance capital of the country, was not hit hard by the Depression, and the Jews continued to do fairly well there. And he also then, in the post-war period, built one of the very first synagogues in an even more stripped-down style, Temple Emmanuel in Miami Beach, which is still there, and perhaps you've seen it if you've been to Miami Beach. This takes us right to the post-war period, and particularly the work of Erich Mendelsohn, who is a refugee architect from Germany, one of the most important expressive modernists. He is famous for the Einstein Tower in Potsdam. He also built the Hadassah Hospital in Palestine before the war. He was able to flee Germany and then was in Palestine and England before coming to America. When he arrived in America with his credentials, every congregation after the war sought his advice, and many put up the money to hire him for their designs. And he went on to design 6 important synagogues, but he died in 1953, and so he didn't see the completion of most of them. Park Synagogue in Cleveland is his most complete and most the one that most clearly reflects his own touch. And you can see it has a massive hemispherical dome. It sits like a helmet. The synagogue itself consists of several parts: the sanctuary, a social hall, a garden or courtyard, a classroom wing, office wing, and then a daily chapel up here in the front. And it seems to cut through the ridge on which it sits above, I think it's Euclid Avenue, the main drag in Cleveland, and like an ocean liner pushing forward, or maybe a battleship sort of cutting the water. You can see its wedge-shaped plan here, and then the circular sanctuary, which continues that central plan going back to Altschuler and going back to some of those Byzantine-style synagogues in Europe, but it has an entirely new look. And the way the pieces are strung together, this is going to be a new way of designing suburban synagogues in America. Okay, so I'm going to step back a bit, because Mendelsohn was one of many emigre or refugee architects, and including a few survivor architects who came to America either fleeing the Nazis in the 1930s or arriving in America after surviving some aspect of the Holocaust. Mendelsohn, who you see here, and Fritz Nathan, both of whom were leading architects in Germany in the 1930s, and both did work for the Jewish community, were able to get to America without too much problem, and they were able to establish themselves. Norbert Troller, who was an architect in Brno, Moravia in Czechoslovakia before the war, he was deported to the concentration camp ghetto of Terezin, or Theresienstadt, and then from there he was subsequently deported to Auschwitz. And amazingly, he survived. And then after the war, after spending time in DP camps, he was brought to America and went to work for the Jewish Welfare Board, and spent the rest of his life designing synagogues and community centers for the Jewish Welfare Board, which helped small communities across America that couldn't afford architects come up with plans for new building projects. So these 3 are representative of many others. I continue to find new not new architects, I continue to learn of other survivor architects who came to America. Most of them were fairly secular in their outlook, but a few, like the architect David Moed, was an observant Jew, and he continued, and he worked very closely with the Orthodox Jewish community in New York for many years. And both his son and grandson, I believe, became architects as well. So in Europe, modernism, after this sort of Byzantine and the Jugendstil, Art Nouveau burst, which you also see in an example here at the Rue Pavée Synagogue in Paris, which I showed briefly in the first lecture, redefines itself after the First World War, partly because of economic reasons, and I'll address that. But I do want to point out the Rue Pavée Synagogue is interesting because it's one of the few synagogues built in France independently of what's called the consistoire, which is the official French Jewish body recognized by the state. This was privately designed and paid for by an Orthodox, what they call Russian, meaning people from the former Russian Empire, congregation, refugees who had settled in Paris during, in the early 19th century, refugees mostly from the pogroms that really racked much of the Pale of Settlement in the early years of the 20th century, culminating in the great pogrom at Kishinev. It's interesting, they got as the architect, the Art Nouveau architect, Hector Guimard. And Guimard is best known today for his subway entrances, his metro entrances all over Paris, but he was a very successful architect and furniture designer, and really the most popular proponent of what we now call the Art Nouveau in French architecture of the time. It's interesting, he had a lot of associations with the Jewish community, and his wife was an American Jewish painter, Addie Oppenheim. And I don't know that much about her background, but she came from a well-to-do, assimilated German Jewish family, New York Jewish family. And she'd studied art in Paris, and that's where she met Hector, and they were married. They fled the Nazis in the 1930s. I think in 38, they came to America, and then he died in New York in 1942. And then she spent much of the rest of her life in trying to revive his reputation, and which she successfully did, so that we now revere him today as one of the most original architects of the early 20th century. So what were people doing at this time? Well, a good example can be learned from the competition for a suburban synagogue in a district called Heitzling in Vienna. Vienna had synagogues that were regulated by the Gemeinde, by the main community, but they were in different districts of the city. And this was a newly populated district outside the center, and was felt they needed a synagogue there too. So they had a competition in 1912, and a number of people submitted, but nothing was built. And then the war came, and nothing then happened until the 1920s. And a number of submissions were given again. Some of them were resubmissions of the earlier designs, and some of them were new submissions. I'm just going to show you a few. These are two that were submitted by the German architect Fritz Landauer, who became known as one of the purest modernists. But you can see in 1912 and then in 24, he's submitting things that are still in historicist styles. One has the dome, and it looks slightly Romanesque. The other looks almost Gothic, and it resembles in some ways this medieval synagogue that was still standing at the time in Worms, Germany, then the oldest synagogue in use in Europe. It was totally destroyed during the war and then rebuilt in the post-war period. But the most radical design came from an Austrian Jewish architect who had already moved to America, emigrated to America, and that's Richard Neutra, who tried to make it with projects for the Jewish community. He designed a synagogue in Chicago that was never built, eventually ended up out in California. He had worked for Mendelssohn, and then he came and he worked for Frank Lloyd Wright in in America, and he began to design houses for the well-to-do in the Los Angeles area. Work for him really picked up when, in the 1930s, when a lot of German and Austrian Jewish refugees arrived in America, and they hired him for different projects. But he submitted in 1924, and this was published in 1929, an idea for a synagogue center that is totally unknown at the time. Nothing like it had ever been built or suggested for a Jewish community at that time. But when we look at it today, it looks so familiar because it essentially establishes the template for the suburban Jewish center that many of us have, attended during our lives. This design was not accepted. The one that won was this one by Arthur Grunberger, which is a kind of decorative little box. Looks a little frothy. It's very simple, modern, if you like it, but with little inscribed columns, arches and other decorative motifs, and a frilly parapet top going around the roof. But it was Neutre's design that eventually would have a great deal of influence. I'm going to go through these very rapidly because if I do bonus material, it will be to talk about modernism in Europe in the interwar years, because this is not a topic that's been addressed much and hardly at all in English. But in recent years, we've discovered that there was a lot of building in the Jewish community in the post-war years, and much of it by the Orthodox community. And the Orthodox were great believers, great proponents in a stripped down modern style, what we would come to call really the international style, or at least something close to it. They did it for functional reasons. They just wanted a room that they could pray in with some nice functional but aesthetically pleasing decoration, but not too much. They wanted a place that was small because these were small neighborhood synagogues that people could walk to. And they didn't want to spend a lot of money because most of them didn't have a lot of money to spend. So we do have some major community synagogues in a kind of modern style, like the one in Bratislava, Slovakia, which is done in a kind of what we call the Czech cubist style. And here's some details of it. And it's been recently beautifully restored, and there's a museum there, but it's still used for services as well. And you can see it's very unusual. It's not historicist at all. It doesn't recall any of the old styles, and it's very au courant with contemporary artistic trends. But we find in towns across the Balkans and in Czechoslovakia and in Germany, Austria, little synagogues going up everywhere that are very, very simple, but clearly, I think what we would call modern today. They have no applied decoration, occasionally a menorah, like you see here at Lipany. Round arch windows, but tall and attenuated, not like traditional medieval ones. They're often framed with a limestone or travertine stone. But essentially these are simple box buildings given a pleasant but not overbearing facade. And we see a lot of these, and occasionally we have photographs of the interiors. Most of these synagogues have been destroyed, so people don't know about them very much, but a few of them survive. Dieberg's destroyed. This is in Germany. Most of the architects of these synagogues were Jewish, and there were many Jewish architects practicing in Europe at this time. These are two buildings that do survive, though, at Bad Neuheim in Germany by Richard Kaufman, who also did a lot of work in Tel Aviv, and this synagogue outside of in Smichov in Prague. I don't know why the label's not there, but it should be. And then this is the addition to the Spanish synagogue in Prague, which also survives today as well. So these are all little modernist gems, not too expensive to build, useful, functional. Bigger synagogues, there are several in Holland. These are actually drawing on what the Dutch architects know of the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright. So if any of you know the Unity Temple in Chicago, you would know that this synagogue at the Jacob Albrechtplein by Harry Elty recalls that design. And here's Landauer, the one who did those 2 submissions for the Vienna competition in historicist mode. Now he's a fully believing modernist, and he builds a synagogue that most fully articulates the Bauhaus sensibility of an architecture being a machine and fully expressing its functions. It's like a factory for prayer, and the windows tell the story. We have the stairway windows here on the left. We have the sanctuary windows here in the center. We have some office or other windows up here in the front. It's and then inside is this large, what looks like a cavernous space. It was decorated with colored bricks and tiles, and then embedded in these were different symbols and other types of decorations, which are hard to make out in these old black and white photos. This synagogue, like so many others in Germany, like 1,400 in all, was destroyed on Kristallnacht or following Kristallnacht by the Nazis. These are designs. This is 1929, so just as the Nazis are, revving up and before they come to power, very modernist designs for a new synagogue in Berlin. And this is the synagogue that was built in Hamburg in 1931, just 2 years before the Nazis came to power. It still exists. It's now a television studio. It's a simpler, more of an Art Deco type design, but very elegant, very simple, but in some ways classical too, because it has this bilateral symmetry with an impressive entrance stairway and forecourt, which recalls the Beaux-Arts architecture of monumental public buildings from the École des Beaux-Arts and tradition. Brno, this little synagogue here, survives by Otto Eisler, and this synagogue by Elsass still survives in Holland as well. So coming back to America, so when Mendelssohn arrives in America, his first project is for a congregation in St. Louis, which is leaving its older home and moving to a new kind of suburb about where Washington University is today. And they're asking for something almost like a campus. They want a sanctuary, they want a school rooms, they want a space for offices and a library and a social hall. And this is what Mendelssohn produces for them. And you can see it draws heavily on Neutra's design. And it is built, I'm not going to show you pictures now, it's now a performing arts center and you can visit it when you go to St. Louis, but I want to come back to see the same type of expression, but more with a wedge-shaped plan in Mendelssohn's design for Park Synagogue in Cleveland. I love this building. It works in so many ways. It's also one of the first buildings that allows the expansion of the sanctuary space into the social hall, something we take for granted now in post-World War II synagogues, because only so many people come on Shabbat, and for the holidays you need more people. It's wonderful the way this sort of celestial dome then floats on this glass drum, which actually serves as an ambulatory around the whole sanctuary, meaning a place you can walk. And there's extra seating on the side here. The big arc breaks the space. It reaches up and it connects the everyday, the profane, the secular, the worshiper, with this more pure heavenly sphere up above. Now, Fritz Nathan, this other architect, was the community architect in Frankfurt, and he designed many Jewish buildings there. The most noted were these buildings at the very large Jewish cemetery there, and this was done in '29. He comes to America, and he gets a few commissions for some synagogues. The first one is in Woodmere, New York, Long Island, very close to JFK Airport. And what's notable here is he uses the Sephardi plan. He has a bima that's actually movable. So he has doors here, you can't see them, that open into the social hall. These doors actually, if I recall, they go up and down rather than slide this way. And then, so the bima can be moved there if you need more space. And most radically, he creates a wall of stained glass that flanks this big arc here. It's really a remarkable building. And then the front has a very functional utilitarian brick facade. He also in the 50s will be hired to do many other buildings, synagogue buildings, which are somewhat more expressive. In White Plains, New York, he creates this almost like an oval, like the Vienna Synagogue, but it's just a half oval that protrudes here for the sanctuary in the White Plains Jewish Center. And then the rest of the building, though, is classrooms and offices, and that's where a lot of the attention is put. And here we see the type of architecture that is not unlike designs that he was doing for the Jewish community in Frankfurt. These are utilitarian buildings, but quite elegant in the proportions are fine. The workmanship is high, and these were the classroom buildings. And in the baby boom generation, this is 1957, it's the classrooms to give a Jewish education in these new suburban synagogues that are as important as the sanctuary spaces, because the future of Judaism is in this Jewish education. Norbert Troller, the one I mentioned, who survived Terezin and Auschwitz, he worked for the Jewish Welfare Board. I've done some research in his papers, and I find that these are all Jewish community centers that he designed when he was with the Jewish Welfare Board. We don't know how many of them were actually built. What they would do is send out plans that Troller would do to different communities. This is Hazleton, Pennsylvania. There were actually plans sent to here in Syracuse too, where I live. And then the local communities could adapt these. But Troller's style was decidedly modern. And I think Troller's work is probably one of the ways that modernism percolated out of the cities and into the small towns, Jewish communities, and into larger non-Jewish communities as well. This is Duluth, this is Saginaw, and it's very hard to find out which of these buildings were built and whether they still survive. Sometimes they were built, but they've been torn down or they've been modified. So this is what we saw of the Neutra design earlier. So quickly, it looks like I'm going to have to do another bonus unit, I guess, to get to all the modern, the really new stuff. After the war, we see Mendelssohn and Nathan working, but we also have a young American, Percival Goodman, who quickly rises as a theorist and as a practitioner of synagogue architecture. And he synthesizes what these Europeans have brought, but he comes up with new ideas, one of which is to add artwork to the sanctuaries. And he becomes, because he's American born and bred, he's very popular with congregations, and he ends up in his lifetime becoming the most prolific synagogue architecture up to that time in America and possibly elsewhere. His first synagogues are very modest and they're very rustic. This is in Milburn, and in some ways it draws on Nathan's design. It's also the first synagogue to have a Holocaust memorial. These stones from the Mannheim synagogue are placed in a little niche because the rabbi of the synagogue had been a rabbi in Mannheim. So these were brought to him. And he's got modern art. This is a Robert Motherwell painting, who was then an unknown painter, in the vestibule. And there was a parochet by the abstract expressionist Adolf Gottlieb. So Goodman was tied in with this modernism out of New York and the abstract expressionists, and he brought a lot of these artists to synagogues to do work. His first really elegant building with a big budget was the Providence Synagogue of Temple Beth El, which is still standing, still in use, and still quite beautiful. I was there just last year. And today you might say it looks like a high school or a city gymnasium, but at that time people were not building like this. This was still a radically new design, and he's got this low vault over the sanctuary. Today we would say, oh, that must be a gymnasium or a cafeteria, but it's the sanctuary. And when we enter it through these 3 doors, through a vestibule and the 3 doors, we see this wonderful wood roof that sweeps over the space and takes us to the bima, where there's modern sculpture for an eternal light and from menorah and other typical things. This is the first instance where we move from the dome, if you will, to the tent. And very quickly in America, the dome and the tent are conflated. The tent of the tabernacle supplants the dome, this heavenly dome, which sort of is more church-like, and various types of tents become used. So I'm going to run through these again. What I'll do is I'll record another little piece of this, giving a little bit more detail of this, but you can see very quickly a selection through the 50s and 60s of some of these buildings. This is, of course, Beth Shalom by Frank Lloyd Wright in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania. This is not quite a tent, but it draws on Wright's design. This is in Los Angeles. I wanted to include it. This is Sidney Eisenstadt's Sinai Temple from 1953. Goodman comes up. Goodman likes to use natural materials, brick and wood, but he creates these tent-like covers, as you can see here, from both Springfield and from St. Paul. And then he has this, a real kind of a bubble tent in his more Miami Beach appropriate Beth Shalom that you see here. And in this plan, you can see very clearly what Goodman is good at. He links the social hall with a vestibule and then the sanctuary. And this becomes the norm in hundreds and hundreds of synagogues across America for the next 30 or 40 years. We're getting away from that now because people now make a sanctuary with flexible space and they can use the sanctuary for a social hall as well. So this is the a synagogue as a discotheque, sort of as a go-go synagogue. It's the beautiful shell that looks like a band shell, and then these the brilliant stained glass. This is from Philip Johnson, the well-known architect, Nazi sympathizer as well, atones by giving this free design for Temple Tifereth Israel in Portchester, where he lives, and he uses a kind of rational box for the form, and then a kind of like little jewelry box foyer entryway. But then he hangs hangs plaster tents solely for decoration, maybe for acoustics as well, to cover the space. This is Eisenstadt's masterpiece. This is the concrete, folded concrete tent at Sinai Temple in El Paso, Texas, and this really is like the tents of the tent of the tabernacle at the foot of Mount Sinai, and there really is a mountain there in the background. Modernism does pop up in Europe. We have the synagogue by the Jewish architect Angelo Di Castro in Livorno, and he's certainly looking at American examples, but he's taken with these prefab concrete slabs and creates something of a tabernacle design here as well. This is in Seattle. And this is Percival Goodman again in Southfield, Michigan. This is Morris Lapidus' design in St. Petersburg, Florida. And this is Peter Blake's design in New Jersey, Livingston, New Jersey. One of the best known is Minoru Yamasaki's design for Congregation North Shore Israel in Glencoe, Illinois. And this is interesting because it's one of the first to sort of open up the windows on ground level to bring nature into the sanctuary. So even though it's massive, it's made of these prefab concrete slabs that are linked together. And then the interstices are open, and that's where the windows are and light filters in. It also opens out to a beautiful view of the lake. This building's been torn down. It's like a tent or a spaceship. This is B'nai Jeshurun from Kansas City. And then another Yamasaki one from Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. Some of these are built like right along the highway, and they really differentiate. They left these classical buildings in the city behind, and then they move out here. The sanctuaries very quickly are discovered to be overly large, and communities have to start building chapels because some of them have no daily congregations, but even their Sabbath congregations are small. So this is a beautiful chapel in Hamden, Connecticut. Okay, I'm going to end with this last one here, and then I'll tie the rest up in a little bonus to get you up till today. And we do have some Southern California examples. But this is in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. It's a synagogue that virtually no one knows about, the B'nai Israel Synagogue by a talented architect, Samuel Glazer. And it's decorated with stained glass by the Israeli-French artist Avigdor Aricha. It's, again, a concrete frame, like a tabernacle, if you will. If you read the instructions for the tabernacle in the book of Exodus, you can really think that, oh, the architect here was putting together his slabs and his panels and his connecting rods in much the same way. But then there are these magnificent windows here as well. The future of this synagogue is somewhat in doubt. The congregation is very small, and they're trying to save it, and they're working with the city of Woonsocket to see if there can be some kind of future shared use. Okay, so let me stop there. It doesn't take you to the present day. We're still 40 years out. But I don't want to try your patience any longer, and I'll put together some of the newest trends. But if anyone has any questions, or Ari has any questions, I can clue you in where synagogue design is going today.
Well, that's where I was going to go. So we haven't, as you mentioned, quite got up to today. I guess we had a grand scheme, and we've seen so much of history. It's amazing. Thank you for sharing with us. But my question is, just because we'll be watching, I guess, the last piece online, my question to you is, where are we going today? I mean, I grew up in suburban synagogues, which I would say were pretty ugly. The most beautiful places I like to go are the ones that you showed us last time at the beginning of this session, which were grand and beautiful on the outside and the inside. We moved to beautiful on the inside and pretty ugly on the outside. And I would say, really don't like the prayer space. I mean, I appreciate what you've shown us, and I see how the evolution is going, but the older spaces seem to speak to me personally more. I don't know about people in the audience, what they like, but where are we going now with regard to inside and outside in particular? Because the outside, we seem to have lost care about what our synagogues look like on the outside, I would say, up to this point, what you showed us. Yeah. Well, so where are we going on the exterior and interior?
Yeah, the 80s and 90s are probably the worst era, and we just get these boxes, and people, even in the 50s and 60s, they were building these big modern, expressive modern structures, which not everyone likes today, although you tend to like what your grandparents liked and not what you grew up in, what your parents liked. So a lot of younger people now really like the mid-century modern designs that I've just been showing. But they can't afford to maintain them because the lifetimes of these buildings is about 50 years. The materials deteriorate, and unless you're going to put a lot of money into them, and unless you still have enough people to fill those sanctuaries, and unless you still have a neighborhood nearby where there are Jews, there's no point in sustaining the building as a synagogue. So they're either sold for some other purpose, or they're being torn down. But today we have smaller congregations. Everybody is small, and there's not a lot of money. I mean, there are occasionally big synagogues like in Park City, Utah. They spend a lot of money there. But for the most part, it's small congregations, and it's almost like the time in the late 19th, early 20th century where little immigrant communities were scraping up enough funds to take over an old building and turn it into a synagogue. In Los Angeles, I was going to show I forgot its name, but it's the gay and lesbian synagogue that is in a former industrial building. It's very small and very attractive. And The space is entirely flexible, and that's the norm in almost all new synagogues. You don't have fixed seating. You have flexible seating that you can change every week depending on what kind of service you want to have. You can take the chairs out entirely and have a yoga service if that's necessary. And that's true not only with Reform and Reconstructionist conservative, but even Orthodox synagogues are going for a much more flexible space because they know it's expensive to have essentially real estate that you're not using all the time. So if you can have a place that you can have your minyan meet, but then you can also have some other purpose there later, that's a money saving. That's what the old Bet Midrash used to be. It used to be a place that was always occupied. We had people praying there, people studying there, and then you had students sleeping there as well. So, you know, the idea of a multi-purpose, smaller, more flexible synagogue seems to be the norm. We also have more synagogues using natural materials. This is something that Percival Goodman began to do, but some synagogues like the Reconstructionist Synagogue in Evanston, Illinois, are built entirely out of recycled materials, and they're a platinum certified LEED building for environmental purposes. So many synagogues are trying to be more green. Some are just trying to build in the woods, far away from everything, but that's not being green because it actually costs more, you need more fuel to get there. But increasingly, as Jews are moving back into urban areas, we're getting new synagogues, small synagogues built back in cities, which is very exciting too. The one I was going to show you is the new conservative synagogue, the Stanley Seidowitz Beth Shalom in San Francisco, which is an urban building. He also has the synagogue out Bethel in La Jolla as well, which is right by the university campus. So those are some new things that are happening. I think there's not a lot of art in the synagogue because that's expensive. Most of the art that seems to be made in new synagogues that I visit is made by congregants. Nobody wants to spend a lot of money. However, as older synagogues close, there is a lot of stained glass, and there are even some old arcs, and there's some other, you know, an Air Tamid here or wall sconces there that are being offered through a number of not-for-profits to congregations that might want them. So we are getting a bit of the old that's been disassembled trickling into newer settings. And that's actually keeping with Jewish tradition because Jews tried to take something from their old synagogue always to their new one when they moved.
Right, so some few last questions. One is, from your historical analysis of synagogues, what's the lifespan of a synagogue?
Well, it's not so much the lifespan of the synagogue as of the community. So in America, the lifespan is very short, anywhere from 20 to 50 years for most synagogues. And that's because we have this continuing exodus, continuing migration. And I've written about this, that moves from place to place. We saw it even in New York City, where the congregation really hasn't left the city, but they've moved uptown. You can see it in Cleveland with Tifereth Israel, the temple. Their second synagogue is now a church. Their third synagogue is now part of Case Western. They're new, you know, so they're out in Beechwood. So they leave things behind. The building may survive and find another use, but for the congregation to use it, staying in a place for 50 years is exceptional. We have only a few dozen synagogues, I think, in the country where the congregation is occupying the same building for certainly a century, but even for half that length. And usually these are places like in New York or Boston where they're fairly stable populations, and even when people leave, there's still enough people to sustain the old building. But you can go to Roxbury and Dorchester and see lots of old synagogues that only were used for 30 years before the congregation moved to Brookline and Newton and other places in Boston.
Some questions. Our audience has been great. First of all, I wanted to thank David Kaufman. He's been answering questions. So people ask questions when you're about things you've saying.
David knows as much or more about this than I want
to thank David, and we're going to have David for some programs coming up. I'm working hopefully with him. But people have
72 chats. Okay.
Right. People in our audience have been to many of the synagogues, or people who have parents or uncles who are rabbis at the synagogues. We have someone who's uncle was one of the architects. It's a pretty amazing group. So I'll send you the chat and you can take a look at it. But the last few questions people have asked is, what are you seeing in the future of just rental synagogues, given what you've said about the short-term nature and the expense? Do you see more communities like renting space as opposed to buying and building? And also, do you see synagogues like working with other religions like churches or mosques to like have multi-use space to save money, and then you have security issues because of 9/11? So are you seeing any of those issues in play right now?
Yes, 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 and yes. There are a lot of efforts for shared space. And this was actually pioneered back by historic preservationists in the 1980s in New York City, where a number of synagogues with churches, a number of synagogues with different congregations have teamed together to use a single building. In my own city, in Syracuse, all the congregations of Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, we pooled our educational facilities, we pooled a lot of our social activities. And now my own congregation, which has been in a building for 110 years, is moving from that building. And they're, for the next 3 years, while they reimagine what they're going to be, they will be renting space in the excess space in the big conservative synagogue, which was designed by Percival Goodman about 50, 60 years ago, which is underutilized. And that way, that will consolidate funds within the Jewish community, so the money will not be going elsewhere. So the needs of one congregation, the Reform congregation, are actually going to help sustain the future of the conservative congregation too. I don't know that the two congregations would ever actually merge, but I can imagine that somehow they do share a campus. And if you go to Austin, Texas, you'll see Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, as well as the JCC, all on one campus, this Dell campus. And you see it in several other places too. It's a new kind of Jewish ghetto. I'm not entirely wild about it. Jews turning their backs on old urban neighborhoods and even suburban neighborhoods and congregating together. But it is efficient, and it is financially, advantageous sometimes, especially if you have one donor like Michael Dell, who's willing to underwrite the start of such an endeavor.
And then my last question is there any amazing synagogue today that that is either being built or has been recently built that we should know about?
Well, I was going to show, I don't know whether everyone would like them, but in Europe, of course, you have a lot of synagogues being built in Germany because you have such a huge influx of Jews from Russia that all the cities where synagogues were destroyed now need synagogues, so they are building new ones. And then in a few cases, like in Munich and Dresden, the city and the state have subsidized to the tune of tens of millions of dollars these new kind of formal city synagogues that the Jews don't even need or want, but they are symbolic. So the O.L. Jakob Synagogue in Munich is very dramatic, and then you have a Jewish museum and a Jewish community center linked to it. But the observant Jews in Munich didn't want or need that. They were happy with the synagogues that they had established. And since it was established as an Orthodox synagogue, all of those Orthodox Jews are in their own neighborhoods going to their own little shuls. They're not going to drive downtown to go to this big place. So it becomes more of a place for visiting dignitaries or tourist groups than for local community. But architecturally, it's very distinctive, very distinctive.
Anything here in the United States?
I think there are a number of little small ones. Well, I love the Sanley Seidowitz synagogues in California. They're big and airy and they feel very welcoming. I think, gosh, I know there are other new ones. I was in a little synagogue in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, a new Reform synagogue recently that I thought was very attractive. It has a wall of windows, so it's very light and airy and opening. It used to be Jews needed windows in the synagogue. It was one of the quasi requirements, but the synagogues always had, the windows had to be high up, so the activity outside would not distract the people from their prayers, but you could look out the windows and see the sky, which was appropriate. But now, beginning with the one in Glencoe, and many, many other examples today. Gates of Grove in the Jewish Center of the Hamptons in East Hampton is definitely a favorite of mine. It was built in 1989, but it's a gorgeous, gorgeous place. But it's, you just look out and you're surrounded by greenery. That's something that people are doing a lot now too. There's a very beautiful synagogue that the young architect Philip Katz designed for the Temple Emmanuel that moved out of Milwaukee up to River Run or something, I forget what it's called, north of Milwaukee. And that's really quite a gorgeous sanctuary. It's kind of part tabernacle, part arts and crafts, but well worth a visit.
Well, the challenge is, I'll put the challenge out.
There are some new ones. There are some new ones worth going. But I'd like to hear from other people because I don't travel all that much. And now that, I mean, the only reason I give lectures, I'm going to tell you the truth. The only reason I give lectures is so I can go visit synagogues. You know, people say, come out to our city and give some lectures. And I say, great. You know, if you pay for me to come, then I spend an extra day or two and I go around and I visit all the synagogues. That's why I have thousands of photographs of synagogues. But if we're going to be doing Zoom for the next year or two, I'm not going to get out and see what's going on. So you got to send me their information, send me their pictures. A couple people through Ari have been sending things, and once I get them, then I will initiate communication with you, and then Ari, only if he wants to be CC'd, he doesn't have to be part of the communication chain. But you know, it's like I depend on the kindness of strangers. There's no way that any one person can know it all, see it all. And there are many, many people who travel much more than I do. I sit at my desk a lot. I rely on the photos of Louis Davidson that I mentioned from Synagogues 360. I've relied on photographs, thousands of photographs that the genealogist and synagogue collector Julian Preisler has sent me over the years. I use the resources at the wonderful William Rosenthal archive collection at the College of Charleston, much of which has been digitized and is online. The Center for Jewish History in New York now has a lot of their materials digitized online. But I really love to hear from people. But learn how to take good pictures, though. You know, don't send me crappy pictures. And I don't only want pictures of people saying, "Here I am standing in front of the synagogue." I can't use those. You can do one of those and then take one without you that just shows the thing. And if anyone would like, I've been putting together a little primer on how to photograph a synagogue. So when everyone's got a good camera with them on their phone, you can take some really good pictures. And don't be stingy. I always tell people, photograph a synagogue like you're the last person who's ever going to see it. And the world will depend on what you record to know what was there. Because we have so few photographs of most of the synagogues that have existed throughout history. And many of the ones we do are partial or accidental. And then we have to try to reconstruct what was there based on this information. And I will say that I did work with a fantastic photographer who went to Syria during the period of the Oslo Peace Accords when we had an opening there. And he photographed all the synagogues. He got kicked out after 18, but we photographed 18 sites. And there the message, what you see is the last anyone is going to know about these places, and your record is going to be the permanent record of these places, is absolutely true, because we know that many of these synagogues were subsequently closed and all of their Judaica removed, but also we know that 3 or 4 of them now have probably been destroyed as well. So those photographs are very valuable. And I know people want to go, but we all rely, the Center for Jewish Art relies on this, the Maria and Maciej Piechota relied on these, Tom Hupka relied on this, the Polin Museum. We all rely on documentation that was done by intrepid architectural historians, artists, and photographers who went out on expeditions, the Anski expedition before World War I, but particularly the Polish architects and architecture students who went out to document synagogues in the interwar years. Almost all of them were killed in the Holocaust. Almost everybody was killed, and much of the material was also lost, but a lot of it was preserved. And that's how we know about all the destroyed synagogues, by this information. we are losing every day synagogues in America. Mid-century modern synagogues, small town synagogues are closing or being torn down or being altered, and they're not being fully photographed. We're not getting any measured drawings, of course. We're not getting oral histories of people who helped build them or prayed in those places. So every citizen, every person can go and do that now. You can record people on your telephone. You can take photographs. If you need help, just contact me. The best way is to do jewishmons@gmail.com, which goes to the International Survey of Jewish Monuments. But I'm also, if you don't expect an immediate response, samuelgruber@gmail.com. You can probably, I shouldn't say that if this is going to be online. I'm going to be inundated with. But
I think we're
reach out to me. I'll be helpful.
I think we're out of time. So you'll give us a bonus track, which we appreciate. I'll share how to photograph a synagogue with our people. And the good news is many of you don't live in Orange County. I mean, you can go photograph in Orange County, but there's nothing really beautiful here. I mean, there is, but not really. But if you live somewhere really cool, please, or you've taken photographs of somewhere really cool, please share them. I know that Jeff Kaufman and Mary Kraft have been sending photos to me that they must have gone on some big adventure somewhere. But I sent them to Dr. Gruber, and you got those. You can see Jeff and Mary up there on the screen. But if you have photos you want to share, please send them to me, and I'll put you in touch with Dr. Gruber. David Kaufman will be back. We'll do something about kind of the interior and what went on in these synagogues and life in these synagogues. We've talked about the structure.
There's life.
Let's talk about what happened in these synagogues and what's happening. But yeah, we're in a lot of change. And look, if you guys donate a lot of money to CSP, we will build, I promise you, the most spectacular synagogue in Orange County. It'll be a Jewish center. I promise you, we will do it, because I can't take these ugly things that have been, not in Orange County, I mean, in general, these modern things. Yeah. They don't do it for me, particularly the 70s and 80s, where I grew up. Just horrible facades and horrible, and even the interior I did not appreciate. So thank you, Dr. Gruber, for taking us on the history of the synagogue. And I hope you all enjoyed it. It was a whirlwind, so you can go back and watch.
It was a whirlwind. It was a whirlwind, but I don't know if it was the best decision to do a whirlwind, but that's what I decided. But we can fill in, the details can be filled in.
Well, this was what they call in college
as you go,
a 101 class. So maybe you and I will focus on a advanced class, and people can apply to join us. Anyway, everybody have a great day, and thank you all for your input, and nice to meet you, like Irv, Oster, nice to meet you, new people. And thank you really for your input about your synagogues. And
Harold Burston, hi, and other people out there.
Okay, guys. I'll see you in Israel on Sunday.